In the village of Seven Rivers, they say you should never plant thorns in another person's path, for the wind carries the seeds back to your own garden. Ma-Duru treated her son's wife like a beast of burden, while her 3 daughters lived like queens. But when the bride finally stood in the village square and whispered a secret decree to the sun, the fate of those 3 daughters was sealed in blood. Gather round, my children, and listen to the tale of the land of the 7 rivers. In those days, the earth was a witness to every word whispered in the dark. There lived a woman named Ma-Duru, a mother whose heart was a cold stone wrapped in velvet. She had 3 daughters, Oma, Chitty, and Ego, whom she polished like precious gems, dressing them in the finest silks the village had ever seen. But Ma-Duru also had a son, Obina, a young man with a heart of gold but a tongue made of water. When Obina brought home his bride, Adaugo, the village rejoiced, for she was as gentle as the morning mist and as hard-working as the harvest moon. Adaugo came with a massive dowry, bringing goats, yams, and jars of oil to share with her new family. She expected a home filled with love, but she walked into a trap. On her very first night, Ma-Duru blocked the door to the bedroom. "A new wife must be tamed," the older woman hissed, pointing to the cold, soot-covered floor of the kitchen. Adaugo spent her wedding night shivering on the hard ground while her mother-in-law sold her bridal silks to buy gold for her own daughters. This was the beginning of the darkness. When the sun rose, Adaugo's bones ached from the cold floor, but she did not complain. She went to her husband, Obina, seeking the protection a wife deserves. In the shadows of their room, Obina held her hands. His touch was warm, and his voice was a sweet honey that promised peace. "Be patient, my heart," he whispered, kissing her forehead. "My mother is old and set in her ways. In time, she will see your goodness and love you as I do." Adaugo believed him, for love is often blind to the cowardice of others. However, when they sat for breakfast, the warmth vanished. Ma-Duru grabbed Adaugo's water jar and poured the contents onto the dry dirt. "Since you have strength to gossip with your husband, you have strength to walk 5 miles to the distant stream," Ma-Duru barked. Adaugo looked at Obina, her eyes pleading for him to say just one word in her defense. But Obina lowered his gaze to his wooden bowl, eating his meal in a silence that cut deeper than a knife. He watched her pick up the heavy jar and walk into the heat, never once lifting his voice. Ma-Duru smiled, seeing that her son would never stand in her way. The cruelty grew like a weed in the rainy season. Ma-Duru's favorite sport was to find new ways to break Adaugo's spirit before the eyes of the village. One busy market day, when the square was crowded with traders from 7 different lands, Ma-Duru let out a piercing scream. "Thief! There is a thief among us," she cried, pointing a shaking finger at Adaugo. She claimed that Adaugo had stolen a gold pendant for the eldest daughter, Oma. The crowd gathered, murmuring in shock. Before Adaugo could speak, Ma-Duru lunged forward. With a face twisted by artificial rage, she tore the outer wrapper from Adaugo's waist, claiming she was searching for the stolen gold. Adaugo stood in the center of the marketplace, stripped of her dignity and left in her thin undergarments, while the villagers stared. Ma-Duru found nothing, of course, but the shame was already done. Adaugo did not weep, nor did she hide her face. Instead, she stood as still as a mountain, her eyes fixed on the blazing sun until they turned a terrifying shade of amber. The air around her grew heavy and hot, and even the birds in the trees stopped their singing. The villagers felt a sudden chill despite the midday heat. Adaugo walked slowly to the center of the village square, her feet treading on the burning earth as if it were cool grass. She raised her hands to the heavens, her voice ringing out like a bell made of iron. "Spirit of the earth, you who see the hidden heart, hear me," she cried. The chatter of the market died instantly. "Ma-Duru has planted thorns in my path, while her own daughters sleep on feathers. She has fed me ashes and clothed me in shame." Adaugo's gaze moved to the porch, where Ma-Duru sat laughing. "Therefore, I lay a word of mirror upon this wind. Whatever seed Ma-Duru plants in my life, may her 3 daughters harvest it 3 times over in the houses of their husbands." As I have tasted salt, may they find no sugar. As I have been stripped, may they be unclothed. As the last word left her lips, a sudden thunderclap shook the ground, though the sky remained blue and cloudless. Where is your harvest, little bird? Your words were nothing but smoke on the wind. Adaugo would only bow her head and continue her work, her face an unreadable mask of patience. Obinna grew wealthy from his mother's schemes, and he too began to treat Adaugo as a ghost, a fixture of the house that required no attention. It was a time of false victory, a season where the wicked believed they had escaped the eyes of the gods. The first harvest began in the north, in the palace where the eldest daughter, Oma, lived. Oma had married a prince who had promised her a life of silk and honey. For the first few months, she was treated like a goddess. But on a night when the moon was thin and sharp, her husband's heart suddenly turned into a stone. Without any provocation, he ordered the servants to drag Oma from her soft bed. "This woman is too proud," he declared, his eyes clouded with a strange, dark shadow. "She smells of her mother's arrogance, and it sours my wine." To the horror of the household, he forced the princess to sleep in the goat pen, amidst the filth and the bleeding animals. Oma wept and pleaded, reminding him of her status, but he only laughed a laugh that sounded eerily like his own mother-in-law, Ma-Duru. When Oma finally fell into a fitful sleep on the hard, cold ground, she felt something sharp pricking her skin. She reached under the thin pile of hay and pulled out a single, long thorn. It was identical to the thorns Ma-Duru used to hide in Adaugo's bedding to keep her from resting. Oma trembled, a cold fear beginning to take root. In the south, the second daughter, Chitty, lived in a mansion surrounded by overflowing granaries. Her husband was a merchant of great renown, and their tables were always heavy with meat and wine. However, a strange hunger soon entered the house. Chitty's mother-in-law, a woman who had once been kind, suddenly became obsessed with disciplining the young bride. She took the keys to the storehouse and locked away every morsel of food. "A wife must learn the value of a grain of rice," the old woman said with a cruel smile. Chitty was forced to wait until the servants had finished their meals, then she was made to eat the scraps left on the floor, the very same way Ma-Duru had fed Adaugo for years. Chitty's stomach groaned with a hunger that felt like a physical fire. One night, driven to desperation, Chitty crept into the kitchen to steal a handful of cooked yam. But as her fingers touched the food, a terrifying thing happened. The solid yam dissolved into dry, gray sand before she could bring it to her lips. Every pot she opened contained only dust. She realized then that she was being starved by a force far greater than her mother-in-law's keys. The youngest daughter, Ego, was the beauty of the family, married to a high chief in the east. She was his pride, and he showered her with royal silks and ivory. During the Great Yam Festival, Ego was prepared to lead the Dance of the Wives, wearing a wrapper of woven gold. The village square was packed with people, just as it had been on the day Adaugo was shamed. As Ego stepped forward to dance, her husband's face suddenly twisted in a mask of unexplained rage. "Stop," he roared, silencing the drums. He accused Ego of infidelity and lies, claiming her beauty was a mask for a rotten soul. Before the entire assembly, he lunged forward and tore the golden silks from her body, leaving her exposed and humiliated in the center of the square. Ego collapsed, trying to cover herself with her hands, but the crowd did not offer her a cloth or a word of pity. Instead, they began to laugh. The sound of their mockery rose into the air, and to Ego's ears, it didn't sound like 1,000 people. It sounded like one person, her own mother, Ma-Duru, laughing at the top of her lungs. The echo of the curse was now a deafening roar. Back in the village, Ma-Duru began to lose her peace. She no longer saw her own reflection when she looked into a bowl of water. She saw Adaugo's amber eyes staring back at her. Every meal she ate tasted like the dust of the sweeping floor. Her sleep was haunted by the sound of 3 voices crying out in the dark, but when she woke, there was only silence. One morning, a messenger arrived, dusty and breathless, bearing a letter from Oma in the north. The letter was stained with tears and smelled of the goat pen. Oma begged her mother to come at once, describing the thorns and the cold ground. Ma-Duru's heart knocked against her ribs like a trapped bird. She ran to Obinna, waving the letter in his face. Look what they are doing to your sister," she shrieked, her voice cracking. Obinna took the letter, his face as calm as a stagnant pond. He read the words slowly, then handed the paper back to his mother with a shrug. "It is just a daughter's drama, mother," he said, repeating the very words she used to dismiss Adaugo's pain. "Go back to sleep." He turned his back on his mother, leaving her alone in her terror. Driven by a frantic need to save her favorite child, Ma-Duru traveled for 3 days to reach Oma's palace in the north. She arrived expecting to find a misunderstanding she could fix with her sharp tongue. Instead, she found her daughter Oma yoked to a plow like an ox, tilling the fields under a scorching sun. The prince stood over her with a whip. Ma-Duru let out a scream of fury and lunged at the prince, her nails ready to claw his eyes. "How dare you treat a princess of my house like a beast of burden?" she wailed. The prince caught her wrists with ease, his grip like iron. He looked at her with eyes that seemed to belong to a stranger. "Why are you angry, mother?" he asked in a hollow, mocking voice. "I am only doing what you told me to do. Don't you remember? When you visited us last month, you sat by the fire and told me that a wife is like a field. She must be broken and plowed if she is to be useful." Ma-Duru gasped, her blood turning to ice. She had no memory of ever saying such things, yet the prince spoke with absolute certainty. The curse was using her own history to justify his cruelty. Fleeing from the north in horror, Ma-Duru headed toward the south, hoping to find her second daughter, Chitty, in a better state. She packed a large basket with the finest yams, dried fish, and honey, determined to end Chitty's starvation herself. As she approached the bridge that led into Chitty's village, the air grew thick and foul. Ma-Duru tightened her grip on the heavy basket, her muscles straining. Suddenly, the basket felt alive. A low, rhythmic hissing sound rose from beneath the cloth cover. Terrified, Ma-Duru dropped the basket on the wooden planks of the bridge. The lid flew off, and instead of yams and honey, dozens of emerald green snakes poured out, writhing and snapping their jaws. Ma-Duru backed away, her heart hammering in her throat. The snakes did not attack her. Instead, they began to coil around each other on the bridge. They moved with a strange intelligence, weaving their bodies together until they formed the shape of a single word in the dust. Triple. Ma-Duru watched in paralyzed silence as the word hovered for a moment before the snakes hissed in unison and slid over the edge of the bridge into the dark water below. The path to her daughter was blocked by the truth of her own debt. Ma-Duru returned home, her spirit tattered like an old cloth. She fell at Obinna's feet, weeping and clutching his robes. "Your sisters are being destroyed," she cried. "The world has gone mad. You must go to them, Obinna. You are a man of influence. Take your warriors and bring them home. Demand justice for the blood of your father." Obinna did not move. He sat in his carved wooden chair, staring at the wall as if his mother were nothing more than a buzzing fly. He didn't even look down at her. "Mother," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion, "you are forgetting your own lessons. You taught me from the time I was a small boy that a man who interferes in the suffering of women is weak and soft-headed. You told me that what happens in a woman's kitchen or a husband's house is not the business of a real man." He took a slow breath, his silence a heavy cloak. "I am simply staying strong, as you instructed. I am being the man you made me." Ma-Duru realized then, with a soul-crushing clarity, that she had spent years raising a son who was now the perfect weapon against her own family. While Ma-Duru's world was falling into ruin, a strange thing was happening in the village. Adaugo, the forgotten wife, was no longer seen scrubbing pots or carrying water. During her years of forced labor in the forest, she had learned the secrets of the roots and the language of the birds. She had begun to trade rare herbs and healing oils with merchants from the coast, working in the quiet hours of the night. Her wealth had grown in secret, like a tree spreading its roots beneath a stone. Now, she moved with a quiet dignity that commanded the air. She wore simple but elegant clothes, and her skin glowed with a health that Ma-Duru's daughters had lost. The villagers, who once mocked her, now brought her gifts and sought her counsel. One afternoon, a royal messenger from the great king himself arrived at the compound. He did not seek Ma-Duru, nor did he look for Obina. He knelt before Adaugo and presented her with a staff of ivory. "The king has heard of your wisdom and your prosperity," the messenger announced. "He summons you to take a seat on the high council." Ma-Duru watched from the shadows, a beggar in her own courtyard, as her victim was elevated to the stars. Ma-Duru could not understand why the three husbands, men from different kingdoms who had never met, were acting with such synchronized cruelty. She disguised herself as a traveler and followed the husband of her youngest daughter into the deep forest. There, in a clearing lit by a single fire, she saw a sight that made her knees fail. All three husbands, the prince, the merchant, and the chief, were sitting together in a circle. They were not fighting. They were sharing a pipe and nodding in agreement. "My debt is almost collected," the prince said. "Mine as well," the merchant replied. Ma-Duru stepped into the light, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this? What pact have you made against my blood?" The chief looked at her, his eyes cold as a winter moon. "We are the sons of the women you broke, Ma-Duru. Do you remember the widow whose land you stole? The servant you had beaten until she lost her sight? The sister you slandered until she fled into the bush?" He stood up, towering over her. "We did not marry your daughters for love. We married them because the wind told us it was time for the collection of the debt. You gave us the map to their suffering years ago." The youngest daughter, Ego, was the first to be physically broken by the weight of the mirror. One morning, Ma-Duru heard a scratching at her door. She opened it to find a figure so wretched she didn't recognize her own child. Ego had been sent back by her husband, but she was no longer the beauty of the East. Her head had been shaved roughly, and her skin was covered in weeping sores that smelled of old wood. She crawled across the threshold, her voice a thin wheeze. Ma-Duru screamed and ran to her medicine chest, grabbing the expensive balms and oils she had kept for years. But every time Ma-Duru touched a medicine to Ego's skin, the liquid turned to gray ash. The more she tried to heal her daughter, the more Ego screamed in pain, as if her mother's touch were made of fire. "Mother, stop!" Ego wailed, pushing her away. "Your hands, they hurt more than the sores." Ego collapsed on the floor, shivering. She looked up at Ma-Duru with eyes full of a terrible realization. "Mother, why did you do this to us? What did you do to that woman Adaugo that has come back to eat our flesh?" Ego lay broken on the floor, her skin turning to ash under her mother's touch. The first daughter serves like a slave, the second starves, and the third decays before her eyes. Ma-Duru's world is burning, but the worst is yet to come. Why did the three husbands really marry her daughters? And what terrifying secret runs through Adaugo's bloodline, a secret even the village elders fear to speak? The answer will change everything. Stay tuned for part 2. For more stories like this, please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel.